Welcome everyone to episode 8 of the Inclusion Conversation. I know that we have a lot of new people who are joining us for the first time tonight. So really nice to meet you. My name is Solène and I am the host of the Inclusion Conversation and the founder of Be Beyond Borders. The purpose of the Inclusion Conversation and why I started this little project of mine back in January is really to break down borders and bring people closer together, one conversation at a time. So welcome to this one conversation, which is episode 8. We've had a lot of conversations prior to this, and you can catch up on them on YouTube if you'd like to. So just about the flow of tonight, we're together for 1 hour, which is really exciting. We get all of this space to ourselves to talk about where is diversity in diversity and inclusion with Ashanti. We're going to hear a little bit more about her very shortly. So that's the first half an hour is going to be recorded, and it's going to be mainly Ashanti and I having a discussion. I'll be asking her a few questions to get us started. And then the second half hour is my favorite part every single time, is when we stop the recording and literally anyone joining us tonight can share their personal story linked to the topic or ask any questions that they have and that they might not be so comfortable with asking on the record. So that's the flow for tonight. And in terms of a little bit of etiquette, so we are recording, so hopefully everyone's comfortable with that. Cameras on if you're happy to, off if you prefer, that's of course fine. We have the chat function enabled and we love to have questions in the chat. So if you already want to use the chat, just pop in, say hello, and the reason that maybe brought you to join tonight. That would be amazing to hear. So just feel free to start using that chat. We have the subtitles enabled for tonight. So if you need them, just click on the closed captions and get them started. We have no break schedule. If you need one, take one. No need to raise your hand, all good. And finally, in terms of mindset, just to encourage everyone to bring an open and caring mindset to the session tonight. We're here to learn from each other, to learn with each other. And some of the topics we're going to touch on may be a little provocative, maybe a little uncomfortable sometimes. So just really want to encourage everyone to keep that kindness and open mind at all times during this session. That's really the idea behind the inclusion conversation. So without further ado, I'm here with our guest speaker for tonight, Ashanti. And so I'm going to be handing over to you now to introduce yourself. So tell us a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Ashanti. I am a DEI practitioner and I help DEI professionals become more competent and confident in their practice. And we also, of course, work with organizations, specifically when it comes to training and coaching of key stakeholders when it comes to inclusive behaviors. So that's a bit about me.
Amazing. I'm literally so happy to have you. Ashanti and I crossed paths quite randomly. And since then, there's been a lot of collaboration. And also, I've loved listening to her podcast. So that's a note for everyone after this to go and check that out. And we'll delve a little bit more into that later. But first, let's talk about our topic. So diversity in diversity and inclusion, something that not many people talk about. So from your research and observation in the work that you do, tell us a little bit more about the state of affairs. Where are we at with diversity in diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. And you and I have talked about this before. And I think, of course, it's really important to remember that diversity is multifaceted. And so when we look across most of the strands of diversity that we tend to talk about in DEI as a practice, we do lack some of that diversity within the industry. And what I mean by that is at the moment, over 80%, for example, of D&I leads or managers within organizations are female and white, which isn't actually unusual because over 80% of HR professionals are female and white. And what we have seen traditionally is the majority of D&I professionals have actually come through a HR role or function or background. In addition to that, just what we can see across the market is these are the kind of positions that we did see more white females enter into. Now, of course, organizations have tried to work on diversity in the sense that they've tried to hire maybe people of color, but we do still see a lack, for example, of males in D&I roles across most industries, for example, in the UK. And we also see a lack of people of color. We see a lack of differently abled people, a lack of neurodiverse individuals in these roles, and it goes on and on and on and on. We don't really even see much job sharing within a D&I role. So on multi-levels, when we think about diversity and inclusion, we do lack diversity. And I know you and I have talked about this, a lot of the even recruitment practices and interview processes for D&I roles are not inclusive. And therefore, of course, you're not necessarily going to attract that diversity into those roles.
This is echoing on so many levels. Like one, when I look at the team that I work in, definitely echoes a lot of the things that you've said. And then two, in terms of my experience going for roles in this space, and like you say, the processes not being inclusive, and also that element of like flexible working not being there. I can't help but feel all of these layers of irony of if we can't get this right, the diversity and inclusion piece in diversity and inclusion, then how can we then influence our organizations to do better and make improvements, right? So, but tell us a bit more about what would you say is the impact of that lack of diversity?
So that is really interesting. So for example, there have been some recent studies released that talk about trust in the workplace. And one very recent one said that one of the least trusted stakeholders within an organization is the D&I lead. And I think that's very interesting. Of course, closely followed by HR. Now, of course, in a one-dimensional way, we're not saying that there's a direct correlation between being female and white and not trusted in the workplace, but it's because of the historical context that we're aware of around inclusion in the workplace, we can understand why that might be, because another study came out, which was quite parallel, that showed only 13%, for example, of HR professionals believe that discrimination exists based on race. So this is really, really quite insightful, right? So we see that, only 30, that means over 85% of HR professionals do not believe that discrimination based on race exists. And we also see that they are the least trusted by their peers and by employees within organizations. So we're seeing the impact of lack of diversity, as I say, across all of the strands, and lack of inclusion within the industry, because actually it's leading to distrust based on what we see here about a lack of acceptance that prejudice and bias exists in the workplace. And as you know, there's not much you can do if you don't believe that there is a problem in the first place. That's a real issue.
Absolutely. And I would say as well that we can see in terms of the progress that has been made in diversity and inclusion, it's been a lot around gender. Yes. And when you see that a lot of women, white women, are working in this space, and then, oh, surprise, surprise, there's been, the most improvement. And I'm not saying we're there. There's still a lot of work to do in terms of gender equality, but there's been a lot of improvement in terms of how do we measure, like gender pay gap, like how do we report on gender diversity in workplaces, etc. So it's I think it's really interesting to see that correlation as well. And so the opportunity then to think, if we have more diversity in the D&I teams, then we have an opportunity to then increase diversity in all other dimensions in the wider workforce as well, because there's been some positive signs with gender. So it's like, oh, we're missing a huge opportunity. So what can D&I professionals, but also organizations and everyone, because I think in this call we have people who don't work in this space. So I guess what can different people do about this?
So I think the very first thing is to, and unfortunately we have to kind of make sure that we're very clear about this, is that what we're not saying is that being white and female in the workplace is a problem in and itself. And what we're not saying is that all white female HR professionals or DEI practitioners, are not competent in their jobs. What we are saying is that we need more competency within the existing cohort. We need more training for those individuals because, a lack of belief or acceptance that discrimination exists is a problem. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is we need more individuals to be attracted to the industry, more individuals with experience when it comes to organizational change, organizational psychology, influencing stakeholders, training, facilitation, more individuals who have the kind of skills that we commonly use and need in DEI to come into the industry, essentially. And we need more diversity of thought, for that matter, as well, not just having people who all think and approach DEI in exactly the same way. That's what we need. So I guess the call out is for other people who know they've got these skills to consider becoming DEI professionals or practitioners, becoming competent in DEI practice in the workplace so that we can make sure that we have more variety of approaches, more variety of mindsets, and more variety in terms of, buy-in for this being a critical function within the workplace. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Yeah, very, very good point. And I think branching out, you've mentioned that a lot of D&I professionals come from HR, and I think branching out in focusing on skills and skill set, as you're mentioning, rather than focusing on, which area of the business you come from, will make a huge difference, I think. And especially the field of D&I is evolving, right? We're realizing that there's a place for diversity and inclusion in product development, in innovation, in branding, in so many other areas of the business. So it's no longer limited to the internal view, which is still super valid and super important, but it's also branching out in a lot of different specialties. So hopefully that will help naturally, organically with that diversity as well. And I think what I'm seeing, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is we also have now, we're starting to see two fields, diversity and inclusion. Because effectively diversity is about, I say it this way, I'm not sure it's a very nice way, but we can debate it. Diversity is about counting people. Inclusion is about making people count, and belonging is about making people feel within that they count. And so if we think about that diversity being like counting people, in effect, we're looking at data. We're looking at, people and how they identify themselves, and that intersectionality piece, which we have so much work to do on. But effectively, we need a lot of data skills. And that's very different to the skills you need to work in inclusion, which are going to be more about some of the things you described, like facilitation, bringing people together, culture change, change management, etc. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that diversity is evolving, which hopefully will make diversity more diverse as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do agree with that. And I think, one of the things I talk about competency a lot is around understanding that difference. Because what we have is a perception that DEI in the workplace is what you said, and it stays at quite a one-dimensional level of how many differently abled people do we have. And some organizations never really get to the point of inclusion. And so then, but what happens is they may skip a few steps and they end up obviously, disrupting, causing havoc in the workplace because they've decided to have like an open conversation on discrimination. And that requires a different approach and skill set. So I think there is a misunderstanding around the work we actually do and the skill set required for each stage. And what we have sometimes is there are individuals trying to do it all. And so actually, and I always say this, there are going to be individuals with skills who are best suited, for example, to policy and strategy on a systemic level. And then there's going to be other individuals who are more people. And they're really good at facilitating conversations, running workshops, going to a board meeting, conversing with the senior leadership team, because their skill set, their manner, their disposition is really well inclined towards that particular piece of the DEI puzzle. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the spectrum of work we do, the spectrum of skills required, and people not being able to place themselves in the right place, essentially, to become effective and competent in that particular thing. The problem we have is that people are trying to do it all. And I think that causes problems as well, you know, to your point around an organization effectively executing on maybe their diversity goals and also effectively executing on their inclusion aims within the organization.
I think you're right. We see so many instances where there's just one person in the diversity and inclusion role for entire organizations. And that obviously puts a lot of pressure. So actually, I mean, I was a little bit surprised by your statistic earlier about the mistrust. And at the same time, I kind of get it, because we are putting organizations are putting such pressure on one individual to literally solve for all the isms in the workplace, which are ingrained, which are coming from outside, which are within people through biases. It's a tall ask. And in many cases, it feels impossible. Have you faced that in terms of when you talk to companies, people, you know, in the DEI space, maybe who fell into it? Because a lot of people in this space fell into it because there isn't yet that level of qualification that is available out there. So yeah, do you come across a lot of people feeling like, I have no idea what I'm doing?
Absolutely. And that's, I would say, about 75–80% of the people I talk to, what they're doing is just following their instinct, which, as we know, isn't really a strategy, but that's all they can do at the moment, with a lack of kind of training and support around what it means to be competent in workplace DEI. And a lot of people are looking to, understandably, content that is online, LinkedIn, etc. And much of that content is very activism based. And that can be very problematic in a corporate organization, because the methodologies and sometimes the approach that an activist might take aren't necessarily embraced within corporate organizations. And so there's a real discord there, I think, about where people in DEI roles are getting advice and support from, and how they are, and what they're basing, their approaches on. I mean, just think very interestingly around, the recent Roe v. Wade overturn in the US. And what we've seen online is companies now coming out and saying they're going to provide, funds, for example, for individuals who choose to have abortions to travel to another state. And I've seen DEI practitioners online supporting this. Now, on the surface, this might seem like a good idea, but a competent DEI professional who is evidence and research-based, who is applying critical thinking, will understand that there are a number of ethical, data, and, other very impractical logistical issues with a company choosing to do something like that. Now, the problem is, because there's a lot of content online, often very activism-based, practitioners are agreeing with statements being made. But when we take a moment to sit back, reflect and analyze that decision or that suggestion that organizations are making, we see how problematic that's going to be from a diversity and inclusion perspective. And that's just one example. So the answer to your question is absolutely yes. There's not enough structured support for DEI professionals to really be competent in their role, whether it comes from support from inside the organization, but also where they might be getting their external, influence and guidance from.
Yes, that's so true. It's like we're missing, it's like we've grown an entire field and we missed the step where we set the steps and the qualifications and the training that you can get to enter in this field. So yeah, I can really relate to that. I'd love to hear a bit more about the Roe versus Wade though. Yeah, I'm just curious. This wasn't a topic that we were planning on covering, but because I have seen indeed a lot of organizations mentioning that, they were gonna support women in their companies looking to get abortions. And tell us a bit more about what are the issues with that.
So, for example, obviously Roe v. Wade is a US federal ruling that has been in place for quite some time. And it's just been overturned. That means that individual states now can decide whether, abortions are illegal, in their state. Now, for those who might be listening in, quite often it's assumed that this is just a US issue. But it is already impacting the UK, and lots of UK organizations have started to talk about it with their own employees. Okay, so although it's not illegal in the UK to seek an abortion, it's caused organizations to think about their fertility policies, which falls under the umbrella of D&I at the moment. So that's just a bit of an overview. And what we saw immediately after that overturning is lots of organizations saying, okay, if you are an individual who is seeking an abortion or wants to have one or has to travel to another state for one, we will have a fund, for example, where we will reimburse you for the cost of that travel. Now, on the surface, that seems very supportive, okay? However, I mean, honestly, I've been thinking about this a lot. And this, by the way, is really in the context of DEI practice. So it's not a commentary on the validity of that law or the moral aspect. But this is really about, if you're to think about this from a DEI perspective, we already have issues in organizations with people declaring their data and identity. What is the likelihood that an individual is going to declare voluntarily that they are seeking an abortion to their employer? What is the likelihood of someone being able to do that without repercussion, consequence, even intangible repercussions such as judgment, perception change, and shift? What's going to happen to that information? So what is an organization going to now do with that data? That's a big question. What's going to happen to that data? What about confidentiality? Now, how many people are going to tell their line manager that they are seeking an abortion? What's going to happen? How many line managers and HR functions are good at communicating in these circumstances anyway? We see the issues that are around requesting flexible working. What's going to happen in a situation where someone reveals that they would like to have an abortion and need to be supported? Yeah, thank you so much, Jill Clark. Yes, but we're talking about the culture of organizations now, not just the rules, but how things actually get done. And we know there's real issues around disclosure. Then we have, if you're going to pay for the travel, and of course it'll be interesting to see some of these policies and look through them in detail, but will it cover a partner who's traveling with that individual? Will it cover childcare if they have children left at home while they need to travel to another state? Will it cover anything that happens to them while they are traveling for that abortion or on the way back? Who will be responsible and pay for any aftercare? There's so many ramifications from having a policy of that kind from a diversity and inclusion perspective. We also, this conversation mostly happens in the context of being a woman. Well, what does that even mean? You could be a trans individual, you could be non-binary and still be pregnant. So there's a lot of things there that need to be looked into, where we need to look at the evidence, we need to research, and we need to apply critical thinking as DEI practitioners if our organization is thinking about bringing in a policy like that. Because it's not that simple. It seems really supportive and it's obviously quite reactive, but we need to really think through what would the consequences be? What are the risks to introducing a policy in this format? Are there other things that could be done to support individuals in the workplace in a situation whereby, they may need some support to seek that kind of medical attention? And we also know it's usually those who are in very challenging, difficult economic situations who will be affected the most. And it's usually the most marginalized groups. Now, what are the chances that individuals from those groups are going to be declaring that they're in such a situation? It's very, very tenuous at the moment as to whether those policies are going to have a positive impact on overall inclusion inside an organization.
Yeah, or whether they will stay a policy in the drawer, unfortunately, because of the culture that you described. I think you talked really well through this example about a couple of things that I'm really noticing and reflecting on at the moment, which is one around that safe space. How do we create the psychological safety so that people are more comfortable, confident, disclosing, whatever it is around this topic, or it could be around disability as well. You and I have talked a lot about that. And then the other element is the complexity. And I think we've been previously historically in this space, and I count myself guilty as well, very prone to, putting a black square on our Instagram, putting a rainbow flag on our logos and things like that. And that's really taking away from the complexity of all of the discussions that we're having, where it's never, right or wrong, good or bad. I mean, of course, there are some lines,
yes,
clear lines, but within those lines, there's so much gray area and so much complexity. And then what you might do for a group might affect another group. And then what about the intersection of several groups? So it's really interesting to apply all of that to this topic. And then, of course, when we're having these conversations, and sometimes we enter into uncomfortable territory, we obviously can disagree with each other within the practitioner field as well, which I see happening more and more, to be honest. And so
fantastic.
Yeah, it's important, right? I mean, conflict, challenge can bring positive, but I suppose it might depend on how it's done, right? But I should stop talking and just let you talk about it. So how do you navigate? Because especially in your podcast, which I love, you're really provocative, really out there. I love it. I love listening to it. So how do people tend to react to it? And how do you navigate when people disagree openly and debate with you?
Yeah, I suppose in many ways, especially on the podcast, that started because I disagreed with a lot of the approaches to DEI practice I saw. And I always say this, I'm not suggesting there's one way to practice or one type of practitioner. What I am definitely strongly asserting is that we need to be using more critical thinking, and we need to be more evidence and research based. And so inherently within that, we can disagree. We can disagree safely and progressively to get the best outcomes for the organizations that we work with and for. Because as you know, there isn't a one size fits all for every organization, which means we will try different approaches, and that's totally fine and necessary. But I think I always welcome disagreement, and I do get a lot of emails and DMs about things that I talk about on the podcast. And I will say 9 times out of 10, it doesn't make me change my mind. It actually confirms the fact that we should be having more conversation about this, because the idea is not that I'm right. The idea is that I'm saying we should be talking more. We should be thinking more critically about the things that we accept as practices in our industry. We should always be challenging the way we do things, the way we think about things, and looking at what the direct impact and outcome is for the real human beings within organizations. And the problem is when we stay in a theoretical space, those real human beings are not seeing any changes or benefits. And so we should be talking, like you and I often do, about the reality, which is, okay, we think this policy might be important or needed, but what would the reality be? How comfortable are we with changing our minds, for example? You can implement a policy, and then maybe 6 months later, a year later, after review, you think this isn't working, or it's not working the way we expected it to. How courageous are you to change and adapt and explain the reason why? That's what I'm trying to encourage, which is, talk about it, analyze it, criticize it, and change it if you need to.
I love that. How courageous are you? I think that's such a good statement and such a good check-in and reflection, and it can apply to everything that we do in this space, as practitioners, and some of us I know on this call are in this field, but also as individuals, right? How courageous are we to challenge the status quo? And that might mean sometimes roughing a few feathers, but obviously doing it with a positive intent and with kindness at heart, to really try and find ways to move the dial and challenge each other to always push for more equity, more diversity, and more inclusion, because we know all of the benefits. So thank you so much, Ashanti, for all of your thoughts.
I hope somebody else comes along and, you know, in, I don't know, 2-3 years' time, pushes the conversation even further than I have when I've talked about competence. You know, and yes, I am ruffling feathers by saying that your identity is not a competence, that passion, lived experience, energy and enthusiasm is not a competence. That is not something I can measure if I am managing you as a DEI professional. That's not something an organization can use to base its strategy upon. I need to see some skills here. Where are those skills coming from other than the fact that you are passionate about this? Because, you know, we're living in a time now where, you know, people are talking about it being a recession. People are talking about being burnt out in DEI. And I challenge them on that. And I say, hey, if you're relying on passion and energy, of course you're going to be burnt out. Of course, you're going to be concerned about the way a recession might impact your practice. But if you're relying on competency and skill, you will survive. You will adapt, you will evolve, and you will survive as an organization or a professional. So yes, I am going to keep pushing that conversation, and I hope somebody else, other people come along and push it even further in years to come.
Absolutely. Oh, I have chills. I love that. Yeah, 100%. I can very much relate to, you know, entering this field with just the passion. That was the beginning, you know, and then it was the next question was, where do I find the competency? Where do I find the skills? Where can I study? And then it was a void.
Yes.
Right. So it's very interesting, and I think it's amazing and so important, the work that you're doing to really bring that foundation of competencies and push you know, all of us to think about what are the skills that I'm bringing to the table, and how do I contribute to this work in a professional way, and not just from the heart. But still, obviously, we still keep the heart in there, because otherwise, like you and I were talking about, otherwise, obviously we're not loving what we do anymore. Yes. So we don't want to take that away, but we obviously want to have in the background the foundation that really backs it up and helps us to make an impact and make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things I always, it's funny because people often assume that I work in DEI because I'm a Black woman, and it has nothing to do with it. You know, my identity and potential lived experiences when it comes to discrimination and bias are completely irrelevant to what I do. I do this work because I'm more than competent, but that's why I do it, right? And so it's really important. We need individuals in the industry who have the skill set to navigate the hard uphill climb within a corporate organization to create more equity. And passion is not going to get you there. Your own lived experience isn't enough. And quite frankly, you know, the reality of it is people don't care about that. That doesn't make a CEO give you the budget to do what needs to be done, okay? It's a whole host of other skills that you've got to harness, bring together consistently to be able to persuade those with the budget, persuade those with the power in an organization to even give you time of day. And that is what we're seeing missing right now across most organizations. It's not a lack of knowledge around diversity. It's not a lack of passion or will. It's they don't have the competency and skills to get the people with the power to give them the green light at the moment. And once they have, to get those people to support those strategies and initiatives.
Amazing. Thank you. I think this is a great point to end the recording part of it, yes. Because actually, I really want to start with everyone a bit of a debate around what you've just said, because you and I have slightly different views in terms of that lived experience and whether that plays a part, no part,
Yes.
and how big of a part, right? So, and that personal story. So yeah, I think that'd be great to have as a discussion point to start with. So we're just gonna end the recording very shortly. So I'll just share one slide. And if you're watching the recording, feeling like I'm missing out on this debate, you are. And that's why you need to join live next time. So if you're watching the recording, thank you very much. Everyone else, please stick around. We're going to have the debate in a second. For those watching the recording, join us next time live. We have 2 episodes coming up. We have Where is Home, which is our next episode. We're going to be discussing the path to belonging with a couple of guests who've lived all around the world. And then we're going to have a session in August around inclusive design and innovation. So how do we bring inclusion from the get-go when we start making new products and services? So very exciting. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. That's at @BBeyondBorders. Subscribe to the newsletter on bbeyondborders.com if you wish to do so. And if you want to rewatch any previous episodes, as I said, this is number 8. So we have 7 already on lots of different topics. So please do go to the YouTube channel and have a watch and just do some more learning. So that's it for the recording part. I will pause it now. Thank you for watching.